Europe is under significant challenges at the moment. I mean, the immediate issue, of course, is the COVID-19 pandemic and how our public health services have been coping with that very, very significant challenge, both in terms of the immediacy of COVID-19, the pressure that put on the health services, and then the cancellation of procedures and operations, overcrowding in hospitals, and just the huge pressure that were put on the public services right across Europe. And then, of course, the trauma of so many deaths and illness as well across broader society. So that's an immediate issue facing Europe. Of course, when dealing with that, the other big issues that have been discussed have been the funding in terms of how we actually fund Europe, how we work our way through this pandemic, and how we get to the other side in terms of ensuring that we create employment, that we continue to invest in other aspects of public services, not just healthcare alone, to ensure that the economies actually can recover and that we can provide opportunity. And civil society has a very fundamental role in that. I mean, the first thing that civil society's most important role is, it does hold politicians, governments, and parliaments to account in elections. So, I mean, that is the most significant role that civil society plays in any functioning democracy. And Europe is a large functioning democracy. Sometimes it is quite, a bureaucratic democracy, I suppose, in some ways, because of its construct with the Commission, with the Council, and the Parliament. But having said all of that, it does work. And I think where we have really indicated our capacity through the Parliament, the Council, the Commission, and broader society as well, is this concept of being in it together, dealing with the pandemic, the vaccination program, the procurement program, ensuring that we roll it out, that people aren't able to access vaccines based on their financial wherewithal, or in other words, that it's done in a fair, equitable, impartial manner. And that was significant. I think that was an important area. So now that the pandemic is, certainly under control from the point of view, you can see that there is a vaccine bonus now in terms of the numbers of people contracting it, those in hospitals and those in ICU and deaths as well. We now have to start planning our way out of that. And I certainly hope that, civil society will be the bulwark in terms of how we work our way through that. So, for example, the economy is made up of many parts, but I mean, the key issue for all of us now is environment, climate change, and how we address that. So the Next Generation Recovery Fund is primarily about priming economies, but doing it in a way that's sustainable and compatible with our obligations under the Paris Climate Agreement, and also under our obligations to ourselves in every country across the European Union. So I would be hopeful that we would work very much in trying to tackle and develop social economies, sustainable economies right across the European Union, developing that whole concept around the circular economy. And that should, while it is and can sometimes be seen as a threat by some people, it must be also embraced as an opportunity to create further employments. So like we talk about circular economies in many spheres, from areas of agriculture right through to urban life as well, and all in between, so that we can work our way through to ensure that we develop a sustainable national economy, but equally from an Irish context, we can build communities too that can function on sustainability. So that be that biodigestion development in agriculture, using municipal waste products, proper recycling, genuine recycling, whereby we can use things and reuse, and that we can really maximize the amount of use of products as they go through their life cycle, from purchase right through to disposal and everything in between. So that would be an area. And finally, from the perspective of the Green Deal, the European Union, how it's going to finance itself in the years ahead and meet the significant challenges. Again, many of these big projects must percolate down in terms of actual how we support and grant aid local communities. So not just national governments and member states, but that we actually start developing funding that goes directly to communities. So in a simple example would be the Just Transition Fund. How do we make sure that the Just Transition Fund is targeted to make sure that communities that have been struggling because of the change of how we create energy, how we use fossil fuels and how we want to reduce the use of fossil fuels. And that would be one area. And the other final area would be the Brexit Area Adjustment Reserve Fund. So the Brexit Adjustment Reserve Fund is there to protect communities from the fallout of Brexit. But again, that when we talk about big funds, they're very abstract, but they mean an awful lot to the actual communities that they are ultimately to benefit. And there is another key area, I think, where if we are innovative and creative as a country and as communities, civil society can play a fundamental role in how those actual programs assist and help communities, work through the problems and the challenges themselves. Civil society has always been, for example, in an Irish context, you can go back way back to the foundation of the state, and even before the whole area of credit unions, for example, would have been a concept that the cooperative movement as well in agriculture, the cooperative movement that has spread out right across the island of Ireland. So civil society has always been playing a very key role in developing new innovative and creative ways of significant challenges. So in the early days, it was about rural life and the cooperatives. Then, of course, you had the credit unions, which was very much about access to credit for ordinary working people. And that was one of the most significant challenges that people had, was that they had no availability to credit at specific times in their life where they may need support. So that's civil society addressing a significant issue. Of course, life has moved on and there's other challenges, but the concept of civil society coming together, both to highlight the problem, but then coming up with solutions, is critically important as well. And, again, you take the environment, it is certainly the number one issue on the political agenda. And of course, politicians are elected to lead, but very often politicians also follow, which happens in all democracies as well. You wish there was more leadership, but the currency that politicians trade in is electoral performance and electoral reward, votes, in other words. So civil society very often has to prompt politicians, political parties into action in key areas. So the environment has become the most significant issue. And of course, how are we going to develop, in a way that ensures that we don't start leaving people behind? And I think that will be the area of greatest challenge for politicians, for civil society, and for broader public administration and business as well. And what I mean by that is, if we just decide to go down a particular route without proper engagement, without proper understanding, we could make certain people very resistant, certain sectors very resistant to the need for us to be more environmentally sustainable in all that we do, how we farm, how we transport ourselves, how we live, how we create energy, how we build our houses, how we just function as a society. And that is going to require significant change. Now, you can do change both ways. You can do it through very heavy-handed, government policies, blunt instruments, in other words, or you can do it through a proper consultative engagement process. And I would like to think that because we want to bring society with us, we want to ensure that nobody feels that engaging and developing new sustainable policies to protect the environment should be seen as anything other than positive. Well, then that's where civil society will really play a key role again, both in terms of advocating and also ensuring that there's no inequalities, that groups, organizations, sectors, particular sectors in our economy, that they could be left behind as well. And we certainly don't want that to be the case. So that's where I would see civil society investing in social inclusion, equality, promoting that concept of community, and not a them and an us, rural against urban, farmer against urban people, all of these things, that we all accept that collectively and individually we have obligations. And I always believe that the best way to develop that concept of collegiality is through civil discourse, civil discussion, and through civil society and all that that underpins. what's critically important in any democracy is that there is engagement. The European Union is an unusual construct. It is 27 member states with different political traditions, different political systems, but all functioning democracies at the same time. While there might be criticisms of democracies, at least as elections, and they can be changes of governments in a peaceful manner. There can be transition, changes of power, etc. So that's all significant and important. And then on top of that, of course, you have the European Union, which sits on top of that with its three distinct institutions: the Commission, the Council, and the European Parliament. And how can civil society engage in the European Union more proactively? Well, again, as I always say, the most effective way to engage in it is through the political systems that are there, in terms of being aware of the political workings of the European Union, holding governments to account about political issues, not just political issues, but about European issues, and having a greater discourse. And of course, one of the big significant challenges that faces Europe on a continual basis, and this is not a criticism of any government. I was often in governments where, if there was a difficult and palatable decision, it may sometimes be, pointed that Europe is responsible for this. And I just think that governments have to take ownership of their own issues as well, and not always be pointing the finger to Europe in terms of an unpopular policy or a policy that's being implemented, maybe for the right reason, but having difficult political outcomes. And that's an area I think that we really have to have a long, hard discussion with ourselves as civic society, as political organizations, as political parties, and just collectively as broader society. How do we engage in Europe in a meaningful way, and more importantly, in a way that doesn't always try and just cherry pick the responsibilities that governments have and farm out the more difficult decisions to Europe and blame Europe for it. And that's something that I feel very strongly about. And I honestly believe if we are to further embrace greater cooperation within the European Union and trying to make it more accountable, more democratic, we also have to make sure that national governments are not always, undermining that concept of responsibility for their own actions by blaming others, and particularly in this case, European Union. So the Conference on the Future of Europe, for example, is an area. The new European Bauhaus is another area where all of these issues can be discussed. But primarily, the Conference on the Future of Europe, I think, is something that civic society should really engage in. It's going to be it's up and running. There's going to be workshops where people, groups, organizations, non-NGOs, many organizations, not from the traditional political groupings or political parties, but that makes up civic society, where they can actually engage in how they see Europe developing in the years ahead. And of course, there is a number of views on how we develop Europe. The questions that are asked often, should the European Union become a nation of communities, or should it remain and stay as a community of nations? And that is a very significant difference. Whether we go for a very federal Europe, where you transfer more powers from national governments to the European Union, whether you have closer integration, more decision making being made by the Commission and the Parliament, and that you start to dilute the influence of the Council, because at the moment, the Council has a major influence, which means any one of 27 countries can at any time delay, prevaricate, obfuscate, or just undermine the ability of the European Union as an entity or as a collective to make decisions. Now, that's not necessarily always a bad thing, by the way, because small countries in particular would feel very vulnerable if you just had a very large or if you did away with unanimity, for example, if you went to qualified majority voting, there would be genuine concerns there. So all of these particular issues are hugely important for the further development and enhancement of Europe. And a good Europe, a progressive Europe, a strong Europe should always be able to assist and support regions, countries that are struggling, to ensure that there is a convergence of the economies, and that's always a significant challenge. But I think our first real decision over the next number of years is, what do we expect Europe to do? What do we want Europe to be? And I think that civic society should play a very, very key role in that, and should really embrace it and engage in it. And political parties should also encourage civic society to do that. So it's not just the political parties taking ownership of the Conference of the Future Europe, or otherwise, but that, you know, we all get involved. Because bear in mind, look, political parties are made up of citizens right across Ireland. So, you know, they're complementary, I think, in this particular discussion around the future of Europe. So I would certainly encourage everybody involved. And that includes the Wheel, for example, which would be very progressive, which would have a great knowledge of Europe, which would see the European Union and would have assisted in terms of access to EU funding programs, access to EU programs. Another key area, I think, where we must really, really push and encourage is for more Irish people to actually see the European institutions as a potential career, not just you know, for a 3-month working experience, but to actually see, you know, coming out, working the Parliament, working the Commission or the Council, that Irish people would start playing and have a you know, more involvement in all levels of European institutional life. That would be one key area. And the other area I think that we must continually promote and encourage and be creative in is in the whole area of the Erasmus program. I'd like to see that being extended, not just in terms of third level graduates, but out into the trades and into the technical areas as well. I'd like to see that we would broaden horizons in that area. And then finally, the other area that Ireland has to do an awful lot of work at, and again, you know, civil society and public policy will have to start being more imaginative in this. That's the whole area of language and our ability to speak European languages as well. In view of the fact that the UK has now left the European Union, we are the largest English-speaking country left within the European Union. English is still very much a working language, but at the same time, once 60 million people plus have left the European Union, it does put pressure on, and other languages become more dominant. And I think it would be important that Irish people would, and civic society would emphasize the importance of language as well as all the other educational areas that we talk about.